morning and welcome. Thank you for joining us. Today we're asking a very, very focused question. How and where does God show up when it feels like everything is falling apart? That's the central question that we're going to ask today. And we ask it because the story that we have from Scripture is one of a woman and her son being cast out of a house, being thrown out, tossed into the streets effectively. She goes and she wanders through the desert, runs out of water, out of food. She's left to die. And God shows up. God gives her a new vision. God gives her a new hope. God leads her to a new place, a life renewed. It's a great moment of hope for us to be able to see God showing up in an unexpected way when it feels that all hope has been lost. God shows up. I ask that you join us today as we listen to hope in our lives. If you're feeling hopeless, if you're feeling at the end of your rope, I encourage you, call the church. You can get in touch with me through the website if you would like, and reach out. If you're someone who right now isn't connecting as well to that feeling of needing hope in your life right now, guess what? There's good news for you as well. Sometimes you are the answer to somebody's prayer, that your presence can be a part of God showing up for them. So regardless of where we are this morning in our own personal lives, I invite you to join us on this journey that we take together to watch God showing up. Thank you.
What do you do with the mad that you feel? What do you do with the mad that you feel when you feel so mad you could bite? When the whole wide world seems oh so wrong, and nothing you do seems very right. What do you do? Do you punch a bag? Do you pound some clay or some dough? Do you round up friends for a game of tag or see how fast you go? It's great to be able to stop when you've planned a thing that's wrong and be able to do something else instead. I can stop when I want to, can stop when I wish, can stop, anytime. And what a good feeling to feel like this. And know that the feeling is really mine. Know that there's something deep inside that helps us become what we can. For a girl can be someday a lady, and a boy can be someday a man.
There will always be helpers. Anybody who is coming into a place where there's a tragedy, just on the sidelines, always look for the helpers. If you look for the helpers, you'll know that there's hope.
This nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. Who taught you to hate the color of your skin? Who taught you to hate the shape of your nose?
Don't let anybody ever tell you that it's white or black. Christ belongs to all people.
In the midst of darkness, light persists.
For women, there is something really new.
When we see the earth from space, we see ourselves as a whole. It is such a simple image.
The poorest of the poor are our brothers and sisters.
Tear down this wall.
Where human beings are being oppressed, there is more work to be done.
What is essential is invisible to the eye. Our whole world needs to work on ways to deal with anger. If we can be present to the moment with the person that we happen to be with at the moment, that's what's important.
So over the last few weeks, we've been looking for how and where God shows up. We've talked at Pentecost how God shows up as a wind rushing through town, through a room filled with scared disciples. How God shows up in the creation itself, the love pouring out of God in full relationship is allowing for new life to spring even out of chaos itself. We've heard God showing up as a stranger and being welcomed in by Abraham and Sarah. And today, we hear of God showing up in the most dire of circumstances as a mother convinced that she and her child will die of thirst and hunger in the middle of the desert. God shows up. God shows up and offers love and care to people who have been cast away. This is the story of Hagar and Ishmael being turned out of the household of Abraham and Sarah. I ask that you listen to these words and start to think about in your own way and in your own life the way that God is showing up in the most desperate of circumstances. The child grew and was weaned. This is Isaac in the story. And Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned, but Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman and her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac." The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. For it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring." So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder, along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. And she went and sat down opposite of him, a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, "Do not let me look on the death of the child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast in your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him in the land of Egypt. Friends, this is God's word for us today. Thanks be to God. So Christian Wyman is an American poet. He has been an editor of famous periodicals about poetry. He currently teaches at Yale University. And a number of years ago, back about 15 or so years ago, he began to have a spiritual awakening. Now, to understand where I'm going with this, I think it's important to look at some of his own life and his experience as almost epochs, periods of major transformation. He's a kid from the deserts of West Texas, having grown up out there in a religious, very, very religious, charismatic family. And then he was educated in what could only be described as a world away, at least culturally. He was transplanted from West Texas into Washington and Lee University. The distance between those two places culturally is cataclysmic. And what had started in his life as a religion of rules and a sense of how God shows up under very prescribed ways of understanding was outgrown. The education elevated him, made him too sophisticated for such things, and this is under his own admission. And yet something lurked inside that I don't think he was able to articulate for a very, very long time. Later he's married, and as he and his wife are starting their life together, even before they have children, they begin praying together. And slowly something begins to emerge. A faith is rediscovered in a way that I don't think he had ever really counted on. And in fact, he has this absolutely lovely quote that I'd like to share with you. He likens faith and the re-emergence of his faith to finding a lone budding flower in the desert of his soul. All right, I mean, he's a poet, so he's going to use language that really kind of captures the feeling, not just the idea. So he likens it to finding this lone budding flower in the desert of his soul, only to realize that it has been there all along. And here's the direct quote. He says, it's blooming impossibly, year after year, year after parched year, surviving all the seasons of my unbelief. And so for him, this idea that the faith was in him the entire time, waiting, that it continued to bloom. And he looks over the course of his own life and he sees all these periods in which everything from the nights out to the way in which he wrote his ambition, everything that was driving him was attempting to fill a void because he was trying to escape what was already inside. I'm probably putting this terribly, and if Mr. Wyman ever hears this video, I hope he corrects me. But he offers us a way to see with new eyes, because he stops his story to a degree at marriage and beginning to have children, but just during the same time period, everything about faith for him is again transformed, now for at least a third time in his life. Christian is diagnosed with an extremely rare and incurable form of blood cancer. And as he starts to go through treatment, as he experiences the pain, the loneliness, the anguish that comes with that sort of treatment, bone transplants and everything, he starts to notice something different about how God shows up, where God is. And he ends up writing, he had written already a poem, or a portion of a poem, called My Bright Abyss. And it turns into the tag for a memoir that was written in 2013. What I would like to be able to share today is that he says something, as he's trying to help people understand where he's come from, he says something about that I think is so true about God, and especially where things are for us right now. He says, and I want to make sure I get it right, so I'm going to read a direct quote to you. And he says this: Christ is God crying, I am here. Christ is God crying, I am here. And here not only in what exalts and completes and uplifts you, but here in what appalls, offends, and degrades you. Here in what activates and exacerbates all you would call not God. As I reflect on those words, as I hear him try to get across his own experience, what I see is a person for whom the cross itself, the cross of Christ itself, sits at the very center of his own being. He has had time to reflect on his faith in very deep ways by having a personal experience of anguish that many of us do not know. It's not to make his better or stronger. It's simply that he has pioneered in the depths of his own soul, a place that many of us haven't had the opportunity or the chance to go to. And he's returned. And in so doing, he's able to give us a vision, a sense of hope, for the grace of God showing up, not simply in those places that I think we're accustomed to, the hills, but there's something below the valleys of our own life. So it's not only what exalts and completes and uplifts us, but the very presence of God showing up and saying, I am here, crying out, I am here. I am here in the cross of Christ. I am here with you in this hospital bed. I am here with you in your anguish. And it's exactly there, I think, that we meet Hagar. If we take time to think about Hagar's life, if we pause, we hit the rewind button before today's story, and we just think of what we know of Hagar, even from today's story. We know she's a slave. We find out she is an Egyptian slave, possibly picked up during the time in which Abraham and Sarah, early in their marriage, had been called out to Egypt and come back. So we don't know her age, we don't know anything about her as a person, but she's an Egyptian slave who works for and is owned by Sarah. We know that she was forced into being a surrogate mother. So Abraham and Sarah are famous in their own personal story, their story, for this promise from God, where God calls Abraham out of Ur, where he's from, and he leaves his home place and he goes out into the wilds following God and following a promise that God makes to him, saying, look to the stars, your progeny will be just as numerous. But year after year go by, and this does not happen. And Sarah, I believe probably frustrated, she encourages her husband to bring about God's promises, taking it into their own hands. And here we are, Hagar, a woman who is an Egyptian slave to Sarah, being forced now to become a surrogate mother. She gives birth to a child, she weans this child, she raises this child, she loves this child. And then in an instant, in the beginning of the story that is taking place just prior to what we hear today, all this is ripped away from her. Finally, this divine promise from God comes about, that Isaac is born. Isaac is born to Sarah and to Abraham, and now Sarah is jealous of any attention falling away from her child. Now, no longer is Ishmael, the older half-brother, worthwhile. And so she convinces her husband to turn out, to kick out his first child and her slave. They're given a little bit of bread, they're given some water, and they are turned out into the wilds to fend for themselves. And so she walks. A woman who has been living on the margins of her world for her entire life is now utterly alone. She's afraid, completely left without anything. So a life that had already been one of subjugation and had been pushed now to the very end is facing the end of life. You know, if we think about the life of slaves of that time, they're very different from that which is the American South, but still there's no freedom. I mean, the life of a slave in that time still set on the very edge of society, a precipice really, just could fall off at any moment. And here we see in stark terms this woman's worst nightmares actually coming true. This is a place where for her, this is not freedom, this is a death sentence. And so here we have her. At the hardest moment in this story, she is sitting an arrow's shot away from her dying child. She can't bear to look at him. She can't bear to watch him cry and die. She's alone in the wilderness. She's been wronged. She's been left at the very edge of existence itself, waiting to die. the pain, the staring at the edge, the realizing that there is something here that is an event horizon from which we can never return. Christian Wyman saw it in his own cancer, in his treatment of that cancer, in the certainty of death, but living beyond it. He never returned to where he was. He became a new creation. He was reformed, completely, utterly transformed in that experience. And here in today's story, we get to see the exact same thing happening to Hagar, and it gives us hope for ourselves with everything we are going through. We are witnessing a time in which we feel utterly devoid of grace, and yet somehow this shows us grace abounding. Lydia Denworth is an author who has written recently for the Scientific American. It's a new article. And in it she says that she claims, and I think she's probably right, that the biggest psychological experiment in history is happening right as we speak. She's talking about all of the strain, the testing of resilience that is happening around the entire globe as this pandemic continues. While many of us have been put into positions, and I've seen it here in the church, here in our community, in talking with friends, in social media, there is, I believe, a very real need for many of us to push this away and minimize the effects of this pandemic, at least in our own minds, to minimize it, to say, listen, we've already figured it out, we know how to do this, we're good to go, we're done. Because the deep need for this being over is coming from a place of recognizing how absolutely terrible this has been. And she talks through all of this, and she says, as this resilience is tested, as this resilience is pushed to the edge, we are going to be witnessing what she calls a tsunami of mental illness, at least in our country. And that brings me to come back to and to think about both mental and spiritual and emotional needs of the members of this church. And I stop, I think about who we are, and so many of us are sitting right on the edge. Much of the time I feel like I'm there and keeping myself so busy that I'm perhaps not paying as much attention, trying to do meditation in my own life, but each of us, every single one of us, is facing the edge. We're likely facing different sources of why there's an edge, of what this edge looks like. Our experiences are deeply shaped by our circumstances. I'll give you 2 or 3 examples. For one, if we look and we think about differences in age and stage, for those of us at different points of our life, there are going to be really different, understandings of what this edge may be. Because for some of us, this is about loneliness, about alienation, about being kept apart. And for others, it is the pressures of being held together in a way that gives no ability or very little ability for autonomy, for a sense of self, where family pressure becomes a pressure cooker, and there's a deep need for being able to get out. This can be for teenagers, it can be for young parents, it can be for the young children. But all these differences that are going on are happening because of people being in very different stages of their own lives. But yet, the same ultimate is happening. And resilience itself is being tested. I think also about economics. And again, this is a place where our circumstances dictate to a massive degree the experience that we have. Our circumstances really shape it. For some of us, this experience has us looking out and trying to find out some of our long-term interests. How are we taking care economically for our futures? Having to make very difficult decisions. But it's still about the long term. And for others of us, The question is immediate, and it is now, and it is, how do we pay the rent? How do we pay the mortgage? How much food can we buy? Or are we buying food, or are we buying medicine? These different experiences are being born of just different circumstances. But the people's resilience, our resilience, is being pushed right up to the edge. And for still others, we look at the news and we see, be it political or social unrest, we see the need for and the demand for, racial justice to finally be met and meted out. And again, our circumstances shape the way that we view this. Almost to a T, everybody I've spoken to in our church wants to see racial and social justice take place in our country. And there's so much misunderstanding and lack of understanding of how to get there. It feels too big to take on, but the experience of everybody leads them to that edge in a different way. For some, it is seeing a world they thought they understood being unintelligible now. And for others, it is very much a understanding that we don't know where to go next. For some who have been put to the margins for a very long time, economically, socially, racially, it can feel like there's nothing left to save. And all these different experiences, and every one of these experiences, every one of these lives is sitting an arrow shot away from watching the object of their love die. I'm struck in reading the story. I'm struck by how similar Hagar's experience, not in her life, but of sitting away from something she loves, convinced that she is losing it. This idea of sitting this arrow shot away and being convinced you know where the answer lies. And we've been asking for weeks, where is God in all of this? I think back to that wonderful quote by Christian Wyman about how Christ is God, crying out, I am here, and not just in the highs of our lives, but also even in the very places where we are degraded, where we are let down, where we feel the pain and the anguish of our lives. God is crying out in the chasm itself, filling the abyss itself, saying, I am here. And then God shows up in this story. And it's amazing. God shows up in this story in a very real way. Because Hagar does not perceive God in the suffering. And when God shows up to Hagar, but says, I have heard the cries of the boy. God shows up. God shows up and showers grace upon grace. And it's this wonderful, inarticulate moment, a very ambiguous moment, where God's full presence is on display. But we hear of God's coming to Hagar, but then there's a messenger. We hear God opening her eyes, saying, I have heard the boy, and then opening her eyes to be able to see beyond. God makes promises, and not only promises, but promises that are kept, promises that bring about a life she never could have known before. Not simply a restoration of her life, but an utter transformation of her life. Grace upon grace is pouring out. This is not a hope for continuance. This is not hope for a better. This is a life that right at the very edge, right when it seems that all is being lost, God shows up and makes the promise that utter transformation is just on the other side. He makes promises. Oh, don't worry about your boy. Don't worry about your son. This one who you think is dying will be the father of a great nation. And we hear at the end, she finds a good Egyptian girl for her son to marry. Right in the depths of the story, right when it couldn't get any worse, God shows up in the midst of the pain to say, I am here, and I am here with you. I will shower upon you more than you ever thought possible. The biggest psychological experiment in history is going on now. Lydia Denworth says, as I mentioned before, that our very resilience is what's being tested. Many of us in the church have been and will continue to face mental anguish, emotional pain. The scars of old will be brought to the surface anew. Each of us will be facing the edge. As we stand there, though, as we peer into the abyss of our own lives, it is my prayer that God will show up even there. That faith will blossom, that flowering bud that has been lying in the desert will open up, that we will come across it ourselves, and we will see, we will believe that God's own promises for us right here today are one of transformation and new life. When I think of Hagar, I think of a person who has been broken by this world and that God comes for her. It's not a saving in the typical and usual sense, but it is an outpouring of grace, of unearned attention and love, of unearned new beginnings. We've been asking for weeks now, where is God in all of this? I would be tempted, usually, to say, like anybody who grew up watching Mr. Rogers would, of look for the helpers, and that's true. But Hagar teaches us, if we want to see God, look into the depths, look into the darkness, look into the pain itself, and God is there crying out.